Okay, so let's just do a little review of our trig stuff and then something fun at the bottom. So you need to have these on a piece of paper so that you can refer to them when you take your final. So let's just practice them. The derivative of sine is, right, cosine. And the derivative of cosine is, right, minus sine. Okay, so the derivative of tangent, this one you may not remember, but it's secant squared. And the derivative of cotangent is minus cosecant squared x. So if you had to memorize them, notice the similarities between tangent x and cotangent x. Secant squared, negative cosecant squared. Notice if you've got a co-function, cosine, cotangent, cosecant, you're going to end up with a minus sign in front of your derivative. Okay? And then the derivative of secant x is secant x tangent x. And so then if you had to have this memorized, the similarity would be, first of all, negative, because it's a co-function, and then instead of secant, you'd have cosecant, and instead of tangent, you'd have cotangent. Okay? All right, so make sure you have those written on a piece of paper so that you can refer to them. Now, I don't know if you remember back from a long time ago. Remember I is the square root of negative 1. And so when we had I squared, remember I squared was the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which is just negative 1. And I to the third became negative I. And I to the fourth got back to 1. And so then I to the fifth, we could simplify to just plain I. I to the sixth, we could call the same as I squared, which is negative 1. I to the seventh is the same as I to the third, which is negative I. And then I to the eighth, remember that's the same as 1. Remember there was a cycle to it? All right, well the same thing happens with sine. Okay? And I'm going to write it this way so that we can have multiple derivatives. So if I have the function is sine x, the derivative of sine is cosine. Okay, so now the derivative of cosine, which is the second derivative of sine, is minus sine x, right? Okay, so now if I take the derivative of that, the derivative of sine is cosine, so the derivative of minus sine is minus cosine. Kind of sort of with me? Okay, so we started with, y equals sine x. So we took the derivative of sine and got cosine. So then the second derivative of sine is minus sine. And then the third derivative is minus cosine x. What happens to the fourth derivative? What's the derivative of minus cosine x? Well, the derivative of cosine is minus sine. So it ends up being minus sine x, which is just back to sine x. Now I'm back to where I started. So if I take the fifth derivative of this, the fifth derivative is going to be back up here the same as this, right? The fifth derivative is going to be cosine x, because the fourth derivative that we just did at the bottom was sine x. Oh, so that must mean the sixth derivative is the same as the second derivative, which is minus sine x, right? And then the seventh derivative would be here. This is the seventh derivative. And then the eighth derivative would get us back to sine x. So notice when the powers are to the 4, like 4, 8, 12 multiples of 4, you're back to sine x. Why do we care? Because on your final, you're going to have to answer something like this. What's the 48th derivative? Well, the 48th derivative is easy because it is a multiple of 4. So it's just going to be back to sine x, right? Which would mean that the 49th derivative, if you were asked that, is, the derivative of sine is cosine, right? And the 50th derivative would be minus cosine, and so forth and so on. So what happens if I ask you some ridiculous number like 325? What's the 325th derivative of sine x? Well, if I were doing it, I would say, I need a multiple of 4. 325 is not a multiple of 4 because it ends in a 5. So how about 324? Is that a multiple of 4? You're like, absolutely, because it ends in a 2-4. But in case you don't remember that rule, it does. It's 81. So I know that the 324th derivative is sine x. Back to sine x. So that means the 325th one is the derivative of sine, which is minus cosine x. Derivative of sine is cosine, no minus, my bad. Okay? That's pretty cool if you think about it. All right, so let me just give you another crazy one. The derivative of 639. I have no idea. I just made that one up. 639. So now I got to find what, where's the multiple of 4? 638? I don't think so. I think it's 636. For multiples of 4, the last 2 digits have to be multiples of 4. So 640 would have been, and I'm going to go back so that I can go forward. Does that make any sense? Probably not. Okay, so the derivative of the 636th derivative, 636, is sine x. So that means the 637th is, the derivative of sine is cosine. The 638th derivative of cosine is minus sine. And then the 639th would be minus cosine. So this, back up here now, is negative cosine x. Hey, that's kind of a cool thing. Anyway, just keep that in mind, and, don't be afraid to, I wouldn't memorize anything except maybe this, but even this you can figure back out again. You've got 2 hours to take this crazy final. So, all right, well, good luck.